The highway was swallowing everything that morning, the fog, the silence, the last few stars fading out over the Nevada desert, when Crockett Boone saw something small and trembling in the middle of the road. He was doing 75 on his Harley, the engine growling like a living thing beneath him, the wind hitting his leathers like cold fists, and for a split second his brain told him it was a plastic bag, maybe a piece of tarp blown loose from some trucker's load. But something older than logic, something deeper in his chest, made his hands squeeze the brakes before his eyes could even finish processing what they were seeing. The bike fishtail-ed, the rear tire screamed against the asphalt. He came to a stop less than 4 feet from a tiny, trembling, soaking wet puppy that was sitting in the center of Lane 2 of Route 93, staring up at the headlight with enormous dark eyes and making no sound at all. Crockett sat there for a moment with his heart slamming against his sternum, the engine still rumbling under him, and he just looked at that puppy. Behind him, through the fog, he could hear the distant growl of the rest of the chapter, 8 other bikes, all of them Hell's Angels, Nevada Desert Chapter, all of them carrying the same patches, the same reputation, the same complicated weight that came with 40 years of American outlaw mythology stitched into a leather vest. They were heading back from a 3-day run through the high desert, tired and road-worn and in no mood for detours. And here was Crockett, stopped dead in the middle of a highway, staring at a dog the size of his fist. If this kind of story moves you, if you believe that kindness can live in the most unexpected places and that second chances are real, please like this video, drop a comment, share it with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe to Only Kindness. This channel exists because stories like this one deserve to be told. Crockett Boone was 53 years old, and he had not been described as gentle by anyone in at least 3 decades. He stood 6'2" and had the hands of a man who'd spent his life working with them, first in auto shops, then in rougher places, then back to the shops again after the years he didn't like to talk about. His beard was iron gray and his arms were covered in ink that told a biography most people would never understand from the outside. He'd buried 2 brothers, one to a highway, one to choices, and he carried both of them in the way he held his jaw, permanently set, permanently braced. The other members of the chapter respected him the way men respect a mountain. Not because mountains are warm, but because they don't move. He swung off the bike before he'd fully decided to. That was the truth of it. His body made the decision and his mind caught up a half-second later, which was how Crockett had always operated, for better and for worse. He pulled the bike to the shoulder, kicked the stand down, and walked back to the center of the road. The puppy hadn't moved. It was a little boxer mix, maybe 7 weeks old, maybe less, with a white blaze down its nose and one ear that flopped wrong, like it hadn't quite figured out what ears were for yet. It was soaked to the bone despite the fact that there hadn't been rain for 2 days, which meant it had been there long enough for the morning condensation to saturate its entire tiny body. Its ribs were visible, its legs were shaking with a fine, continuous tremor that Crockett recognized immediately as the particular shiver of something that has given up expecting rescue. He crouched down in the middle of Route 93 and held out his hand. The puppy looked at his hand. Then it looked at his face. Then, with an effort that seemed enormous for something so small, it took 2 wobbling steps forward and put its chin on his palm. The other bikes pulled up around him. He heard the engines cutting, one by one. He heard boots on asphalt. He heard Fetch, real name Gerald, but nobody called him that, say something low and amused. He heard Dez, the youngest member at 31, make a sound that was trying to be a laugh and not quite getting there. He didn't look up. He was still looking at the puppy, which had closed its eyes and was now pressing the full weight of its chin into his calloused hand as if this were the safest place on earth. Crockett. That was Holloway, the chapter president, who had known Crockett since they were both young men doing things they'd prefer not to remember. "What are we doing here, brother?" Taking a minute, Crockett said. There was a pause. "That's a puppy, I noticed." Another pause. "You planning on leaving it?" Crockett looked up then, and something in his face made Holloway, who was not easily made to feel anything, go quiet. "No," Crockett said, "just the one word," and that was the end of that conversation. He unzipped the front of his leather jacket and tucked the puppy inside against his chest, feeling it immediately burrow toward the warmth with a desperation that broke something open in him quietly, like a seam giving way. He zipped it back up carefully, leaving a few inches open at the top for air, and he could feel the tiny heart beating against his sternum, fast and frightened and alive. He walked back to his bike. He got on. He felt the puppy shift and settle and then go still, and he sat there for a moment before starting the engine because he needed that moment, though he couldn't have explained why to anyone who asked. They rode the next hour and 40 minutes to Elko, and Crockett rode slower than he ever did, smoother than he'd ridden in years, taking the curves with a gentleness that Fetch would tease him about for the next 6 months. The puppy slept against his chest the whole way. He could feel it breathing. The vet clinic in Elko was called Sunrise Animal Care, and the woman who ran it was Dr. Aveline Marsh, who was 44 and had the particular brand of unshockable competence that comes from 20 years of treating animals in rural Nevada. She had seen a lot of things walk through her door. She had not previously seen 9 Hells Angels bikers walk through it together, one of them holding his jacket closed with both hands and asking in a voice that was trying very hard to be casual whether she had a minute. She had a minute. She examined the puppy on the steel table while Crockett stood at the table's edge and watched with an expression that Dr. Marsh would later describe to her husband as a man trying not to look like he was praying. The puppy was severely dehydrated, underweight, and had a respiratory infection that was heading toward serious. It was also, miraculously, structurally intact, no broken bones, no injuries from the road, no signs of abuse beyond the neglect that had left it alone and wet and starving in the middle of a highway at dawn. Dr. Marsh started an IV line for fluids. She gave a small injection. She wrapped the puppy in a heated blanket and set it in an observation crate, and she told Crockett that with treatment, the puppy had a good chance. Crockett asked what the treatment would cost. She told him. He pulled out his wallet and paid it in full, in cash, without blinking. Then he sat down in the waiting room chair, a plastic chair sized for a normal human being, which looked faintly absurd under a man his size, and he waited. The other 8 members of the chapter found various positions around the waiting room. Des sat on the floor because there weren't enough chairs. Fetch read a magazine about houseplants with the focused attention of a man determined to seem normal. Holloway stood by the window with his arms crossed and looked out at the parking lot and said nothing, which was his way of saying everything was fine. The puppy stayed at the clinic for 3 days. Crockett stayed in Elko for 3 days. This was not something he announced or explained. He simply booked a room at the motel 2 blocks from Sunrise Animal Care and visited the clinic every morning and every evening, and Dr. Marsh, who had initially been guarded in the way that people sometimes are around men with Crockett's particular appearance, stopped being guarded somewhere in the middle of the 2nd day. It's difficult to remain guarded around a man who asks about a puppy's oxygen levels with the intensity of a father in a hospital waiting room. On the 3rd day, drive, Marsh told Crockett he could take the dog home. She handed him a bag with medications, a small can of prescription food, and a printed sheet of care instructions. She also handed him, on impulse, a small blue collar she'd pulled from the clinic's donation box. He put the collar on the puppy with hands that were not entirely steady. The puppy immediately began trying to eat the collar, which Dr. Marsh told him was a very good sign. He named the puppy Wrench. What happened next is the part of this story that people find difficult to believe, though every word of it is true. Crockett Boone rode back to his chapter's town of Winnemucca with Wrench in a purpose-built carrier strapped to the front of his Harley. He'd driven to the nearest town with a pet supply store and spent 2 hours finding exactly the right one, which Fetch documented photographically and which became a point of significant pride within the chapter despite everyone pretending otherwise. Back in Winnemucca, Wrench moved into Crockett's house, a 3-bedroom place on the edge of town that was, by Crockett's own admission, not exactly set up for a puppy. This meant the first 2 weeks involved a great deal of improvisation, a destroyed work boot, one incident with a power cord that aged Crockett visibly, and the construction of a small enclosed yard area that Crockett built himself over a single long weekend with more care than he'd given any project in recent memory. But here is where the story shifts into something larger than one man and one dog. Winnemucca had a problem that the town had been struggling with for several years, a rural animal shelter that was chronically underfunded, understaffed, and operating at triple capacity. The county didn't have the budget. The volunteers were burning out. Animals were being turned away or transferred to facilities hours away, and the local newspaper had run the same heartbreaking story 3 times in 2 years with no meaningful result. It was the kind of quiet, grinding crisis that medium-sized rural towns carry without resolution because nobody with resources is looking in the right direction. Crockett started looking. It began small. He made a donation, substantial but anonymous, which Dr. Marsh helped facilitate because he'd called her for advice on who to contact. He drove to the shelter one Thursday afternoon and walked through it, and what he saw there did something to him that he couldn't name and didn't try to. He went back the next Thursday. And the one after that. He started asking the shelter director, a tired woman named Solange Reyes who had been doing this work for 11 years on a salary that made the commitment almost incomprehensible, what she actually needed. Not what she'd settled for. What she actually needed. She told him. He listened. He took notes in a small spiral notebook with a golf pencil, which Des would later say was the most surreal thing he'd ever witnessed, and he'd witnessed some things. What followed over the next 8 months was a campaign that began with the Hells Angels Nevada Desert chapter and eventually expanded outward in ways that nobody, least of all Crockett, had planned or predicted. The chapter organized a benefit run in the spring that raised more money than the shelter had seen in 3 consecutive years of traditional fundraising. Crockett worked with a lawyer he knew to help the shelter apply for a federal rural services grant that Solange hadn't known existed. He reached out to a motorcycle manufacturer's community fund that he'd heard about through a contact in California, and that call resulted in a donation of equipment that allowed the shelter to finally fix its ventilation system, a problem that had been creating health issues for animals and staff alike for over 2 years. He also, quietly and without any announcement, began fostering. Wrench was the first, then a 3-legged hound mix that the shelter couldn't place because of his size. Then a mother cat and 4 kittens, which Fetch discovered during a chapter meeting at Crockett's house and which resulted in a photograph, Crockett sitting in his chair, 2 kittens asleep on his shoulders, Wrench asleep on his boots, his face wearing the expression of a man who is pretending this is all perfectly normal, that circulated through the chapter and beyond it, and eventually found its way online, where it generated the kind of response that genuine moments tend to generate when they escape into the world. People saw the photo and wanted to know the story. A journalist from a regional paper wrote a piece. The piece got picked up, and Crockett, who had spent most of his life being perceived as a certain kind of man and had grown accustomed to that perception, found himself in the strange position of being visible in a completely different way, not as something people crossed the street to avoid, but as something people drove out of their way to support. He didn't love the attention. He said so clearly and often. But he understood, through conversations with Solange and with Holloway and once, unexpectedly, with Dr. Marsh over coffee after a vet visit, that the visibility was helping the animals. So he made his peace with it in the way he made his peace with most things, quietly, practically, and without much discussion. By the end of that year, the Winnemucca shelter had a new intake facility, 3 additional paid staff members, and a waiting list of approved fosters for the first time in its history. Solange Reyes, who had cried twice in the past 11 years and both times in private, cried at the ribbon-cutting ceremony in front of everyone and didn't apologize for it. Crockett stood at the back of the crowd with Wrench on a leash, Wrench, who was now nearly full-grown and had the confident, slightly chaotic energy of a dog who has been deeply loved from an early age, and he watched Solange cry, and he looked down at his dog, and he didn't say anything because there was nothing to say that the moment wasn't already saying better. Before we reach the end of this story, we have one small request. Drop a comment below and tell us, where are you watching this from, and has a stranger's act of kindness ever changed something for you? We read every single one. Crockett Boone did not become a different person. That's important to say. He was still the man he'd always been, complicated, private, blunt, carrying his history in the set of his jaw. He still rode. He still wore the patch. He still had decades of choices behind him that he'd made and couldn't unmake, the way all of us have years we can't revise. But something had shifted in the architecture of his days, and he knew it, and on the mornings when he sat on the back step of his house with his coffee while Wrench ran circuits around the yard in that joyful, purposeless way that dogs run when they are simply happy to be alive, he felt something he'd forgotten was still available to him. Not peace, exactly. Something more active than peace. Something more like purpose. The puppy he'd stopped for on a foggy Nevada highway at 75 miles an hour. The one with the wrong flopped ear and the trembling legs and the chin that had found his palm like it knew something Crockett hadn't figured out yet, had not saved his life in any dramatic sense. His heart was still beating before he stopped. But Wrench had done something that might have been harder. He'd given Crockett a reason to use the part of himself he'd kept folded away for 30 years. The part that was careful. The part that was patient. The part that built small fenced yards on long weekends and took notes in spiral notebooks and drove slow on highways so the heartbeat against his chest stayed steady. Some people go their whole lives and never find what it is that finally opens that part of them. Crockett found it in the middle of Route 93 at dawn, soaking wet and staring up at a headlight, shaking but still there. Still waiting, still hoping, against every reason it had not to, that someone would stop. If this story reached you today, if it reminded you of something you needed to remember, please like this video, share it with someone who believes in the quiet power of unexpected kindness, and subscribe to Only Kindness. Every story we tell is proof that goodness shows up in places we never thought to look. Thank you for being here.